Hey guys, I am the Comics Kid 2099 and I wanted to do something a little different than what I normally do. Something occurred to me. This is something that periodically occurs to me, usually when I hear creators, either in the film industry or the comic book industry, when I hear them talk about what could have been, what they almost did, what they wanted to do, and for whatever reason these things never happened. And I decided to try and compile a list of things that I wish I could have seen those things happen in the way that I will explain as we go forward. This list will include things from film and it will include things from comic books, and at least a couple of my examples will be things from television. Most of this is going to be tangential to comic books, if not directly straight up comic books. One thing I want to clear up before we get started, this is not something that is completely impossible and I just wish it could happen. For example, I'm not going to be saying, I wish Jack Kirby could come back from the dead and work on Demon Knights at DC Comics. Well, since Jack Kirby's dead, I'm not going to say I wish that, he was working on something. There is going to be one item on this list that's kind of along those lines, and I'm kind of breaking my own rules there. But for the most part, these are things that almost happened and for whatever reason did not happen. I want to start off with an honorable mention. After the animated direct-to-video movie Batman Sub-Zero, there was almost another Batman movie that was put out. It was going to be headed up by an artist and storyboarder, Stephen Gordon, and it was going to be called Batman Asylum. Now, we don't know a whole lot about this movie other than very rough plot details. We know that Bruce Wayne was engaged and was contemplating getting rid of the Batman identity permanently. We know that some of the Arkham inmates were going to be experimented on, and we know that Bane was going to injure Robin some way. And I assume that this injury was going to pull Batman back into the fold and he was going to go off and do superhero things. Now, I really do think this could have been a neat story. I don't necessarily think it deserves to be on my list simply because we know so very little about what it could have been. I know that the character models were going to be slightly revised, slightly altered from what they were in the animated series, and I'm honestly okay with that, especially since that has basically been happening ever since Superman Doomsday, when all of the character models are pretty much revised from the ground up every time they make a new movie. But I don't think that this movie would have been completely 100% solid gold. I am especially a little bit iffy on the idea of Bruce Wayne being engaged to some woman who we don't even know and we've never seen before in the animated series. It doesn't have any build-up. I think that would have been a little bit cliche. But other than that, I think this could have been a fun little movie. And the reason that it didn't happen is because they decided to instead go with Batman Beyond Return of the Joker. Now, I enjoy that movie for the most part. I do think that if we could have had some kind of world where we got Return of the Joker and Batman Asylum, I really wish we could have had both of those, but if I had to choose, I would have gone ahead and gone with Return of the Joker. And now, on to the actual list. Number 10. I talked about this a little bit before in one of my I Stand Alone videos, but in the 1990s, the early 1990s, Alan Moore was brought in to work on a mini-series / series of one-shots called 1963. And basically, he was kind of making fun of Marvel from the 1960s, kind of showing his appreciation for the 60s. Depending on when you talk to Alan Moore, he's either a fan of Marvel Comics and the Bullpen staff, stuff like that, or he really hates Stan Lee. So I'm not really sure if you could say that this was a mean-spirited jab or if it was a loving homage. Either way, there were 6 issues, each one kind of homaging a different Marvel character. So the Fury was very similar to Spider-Man, and Mystery Inc. was very similar to the Fantastic Four, etc. Now, like I said in my I Stand Alone video, this was an alternate world where these superheroes did not exist in the Image Comics universe, and then in the very last issue we find out that Shaft from Young Blood, who he existed in the actual Image universe, he had come to the 1963 universe and kidnapped one of the members of the Fantastic Four. and then the story ends. Several of the co-founders of Image Comics, they were all wanting Alan Moore to work on their own stories, so this basically was making him a little bit more busy, and basically the story never concluded. If I could, I would have gone back in time. I would have somehow used my magic powers to change this so that we would have gotten the completion of this story. I really wanted to see why the 1990s heroes were waging war on the 1960s heroes, and I would have loved to have seen a big, huge, sprawling battle between the Savage Dragon, Spawn, and Youngblood, and all the 1960s heroes, which that was hinted at something that was going to happen. And I think that could have been really cool, but it's not something that I, lose sleep at night wishing that it had been a thing. I think it would have been neat, but I'm not desperately wishing that it had happened. Number 9 is a somewhat similar situation. In the very late 90s, 4 comic book writers, Mark Waid, Mark Millar, Grant Morrison, and Tom Peyer, they got together and they put together a pitch for how they would handle the Superman books. This was apparently requested by an assistant editor who was taking over the Superman books while the main editor was vacationing out of town somewhere. And they put together this pitch called Superman 2000. And you can find this online pretty easily. I've read it a few times myself. And there were some things in this pitch I did not like, but a lot of their ideas I think were workable, and also I think they had the right spirit in mind when they were tackling Superman. I think a lot of their ideas, even if they didn't work, they came from a good place and a heart, and I really would have loved to have seen what these guys would have done with Superman in the very early 2000s. The reason this didn't happen is that the main editor, who was on vacation, he comes back and he sees this pitch for a Superman revamp, which, as far as he knows, this was just sent to him unsolicited. So he kind of gets in a fury and he tells these guys, "You will never work on Superman." And then, from the words of, I believe, Mark Waid, he actually said something to the effect of, imagine giving the keys to the Lamborghini to a teenager who just learned to drive, which is kind of a nonsense answer since at least a few of these guys had been writing for a long time. In the late 90s, Grant Morrison had been writing for at least 10 years. He had been writing at DC since the very late 80s and had been writing outside of DC since earlier than that. The reason that I'm not full-on really wishing that this had been a thing is because at least a few of these guys got together later on and they worked on 52. Grant Morrison and Mark Waid were both part of the 52 series, which lasted a year. It was a weekly series. And after that, basically, they just stopped working together. I don't think it was that they were mad at each other. I think it's that they were just exhausted from working on a weekly series for a year. And if you read the Superman 2000 pitch, basically their idea was to handle all 4 of the Superman books in the same way. You would have 4 writers and 4 Superman books, and they would have treated all 4 of the books as if it was one Superman title that came out once a week. And I think if they had actually been accepted and they've been allowed to do this, I'm afraid that they would have gotten like a year into this and they would have just been exhausted from working on such a rough schedule for so long, and it probably wouldn't have lasted as long as they would have liked. And that's just based on kind of what I'm seeing from 52, where I've seen from a few different interviews, they all said, wow, that was really exhausting. And I think that's also kind of a reason why those 4 writers who worked on 52, not the same 4 who worked on Superman 2000, but the 52 writers, I think that's the reason that they didn't come and do Countdown to Final Crisis, because, well, they were just so beat from doing 52. So that's why I'm not full on saying, why didn't this happen? Dang you, DC Comics, this should have been a thing. Because I feel like if it had been a thing, then we probably wouldn't have had it for very long. It would have just been a little blip in Superman comic book history, and then we would have forgotten about it, and other writers would have come in and done their own thing. Not to mention, I kind of liked what we got in the Superman books instead of the Superman 2000 books. If I'm not mistaken, Jeff Loeb and Ed McGuinness, those guys were working on Superman, as well as Joe Kelly and Joe Casey. Those guys were all working on the Superman books in the early 2000s, and I believe they were the choice that DC went with instead of the Superman 2000 pitch. And from what little I've read from that era, I actually really like those Superman comics. So I'm not saying I wish those comics didn't exist. I'm really just saying I wish I could go to the alternate dimension where Superman 2000 did happen, and I could see if it was really cool, if it lasted very long. I'm sure it would have been something neat to see, just based on what I love from those writers, some of those writers. This next one is another one that I'm not saying I wish it had happened. I'm just saying I wish I could have seen what this would have been like, but I'm not saying I wish it had absolutely been a thing. If you've ever read the story Crisis on Infinite Earths, then you know that a lot of superheroes died in that story. And back in the day, when this story came out, the idea was we're just going to clear out the multiverse, and we're basically going to take characters from about 5 of the worlds from that multiverse, and we're going to put them all on one world. Now, in the years that followed, the idea was that the characters did not even remember there ever being a multiverse. But if you go and read Crisis on Infinite Earths, that is very clearly not the case. In the final issue of that series, all of the characters who survived, they did remember that there used to be a multiverse. So you had characters from the JSA, they remembered that they used to be from a world called Earth 2, and now they were living on the same world as the heroes from Earth 1. So near the end of the book, you had some characters like the Superman from Earth 2. He was a little bit older, he had gray hair in his temples, and then you had the Superman from Earth 1, he was younger, and he was the Superman, basically. And at the end of the story, Superman from Earth 2, Lois Lane from Earth 2, and Superboy from Earth Prime, they all get sucked into this paradise dimension. They don't really die, but they're basically never to be seen again until 20-ish years later, Jeff Johns brought them back in the story Infinite Crisis. But for the purposes of Crisis on Infinite Earths, at the time that that story was happening, they were never going to be seen again. It was basically just Marv Wolfman's way of getting rid of them without actually killing off those characters. Now, legend has it that Chris Claremont, who wrote the X-Men for 16 years, he had made a suggestion. I don't know if he made this suggestion to Marv Wolfman or John Byrne, but he made a suggestion that instead of taking old Superman and putting him away in an alternate universe where we're never going to see him again, his suggestion was kill the young Superman, the Superman from Earth 1. Kill him off, and then keep old Superman from Earth 2 around. And then after everything is said and done, old Superman would wipe off some makeup, he would take the hair dye out of his hair, and he would look exactly the same. And he would basically say, well, there's no reason for me to keep all this on here. I was basically just doing it so that I would look my age. And then the idea was that John Byrne's Man of Steel series would follow old Superman, who has already had some 40 years of adventures, and he's basically showing up in this world where Superman hasn't been a thing yet. It's a little unclear just how much of a reboot Crisis on Infinite Earths would have to be for this to happen. But basically the idea was that you have a Superman from an alternate Earth, and then he becomes the Superman on the main DC Earth, and then he's meeting Lois Lane for the first time, even though he knows that on his world he married Lois Lane and was married to her for like 20 years. On this world, she's never heard of Superman. She's never heard of Clark Kent. So in theory, he would be trying to build that relationship that he knows could be a thing, but he has to play it safe. He can't say, I know who you are, I'm married to you on an alternate world. That would be a little weird, it would be a little creepy. This is another one of those things. I'm not exactly saying that I wish this had been the thing that they went with, even though I don't really like John Byrne's Man of Steel series. I think this would have been a very interesting thing to just... It'd be another one of those things I'd love to go to an alternate Earth where this actually happened, and I'd love to see what it would have been like, but I don't think that it would have worked ultimately. I think it would have caused more problems later on whenever writers were trying to say that the characters did not even remember the multiverse. And Superman from Earth 2, if he had come from Earth 2 and was like 20 or 40 years older than all these other characters, that would have been a little bit problematic. I think that would have been a very interesting story, but I'm, alas, kind of glad that they didn't go in that direction. But I do think it would have been very interesting. Number 7. This one is actually a film. Everyone in the world knows that in 1997, Joel Schumacher directed Batman and Robin, and everyone thinks that that is one of the worst movies in the universe. I don't especially love the movie, but I also am not one of those people who bashes on the movie for no real good reason. I am saying the movie is bad, so don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's a good movie, but at the same time, I don't think that it deserves all of the criticisms that it gets. Legend has it that Joel Schumacher was not really happy with that movie. He wanted to do a darker Batman movie, but the studios were saying, no, you have to make something child-friendly, and thus Batman and Robin came out. After Batman and Robin, he wanted to do another movie called Batman Year One, and I don't know a whole lot about what this would have been, other than apparently Kurt Russell was his choice to play a young Commissioner Gordon. But I think this could have been very interesting. Now, before you rip me to shreds, just keep in mind that Joel Schumacher is actually a good filmmaker. He's done movies like Phantom of the Opera, and he did the number 23. Both of those were very dark movies and were better films than Batman Forever and Batman and Robin. I think if he was left to his own devices, if he did not have executive meddling going on behind him, I think Joel Schumacher could have done a killer dark Batman. And I would have really loved to have seen a Year One movie that sort of does the same thing that Batman Begins did. Now, once again, I think if this had actually happened, I don't really think that it would have been better at the end of the day, because if this had been a thing, we probably never would have had Batman Begins, which is actually my favorite Batman movie of all time. And even though I don't like The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises as much as Batman Begins and as much as everyone else, I do think that they're okay films, and I would have loved to have seen those much more than I would have loved to have seen Joel Schumacher's Year One. But once again, this is another one of those things where I wish I could see that movie without actually seeing the ripple effect that it would have caused all across pop culture. For example, I would have loved to have had a Batman Year One by Joel Schumacher, as long as it didn't mean that we weren't going to get a Batman Begins by Christopher Nolan. Number 6, taking things back to the comic book side of things. If you are a little bit familiar with comic books from the 1990s and you are looking at my username right now, then you probably know that I am a huge fan of the Marvel Comics sub-universe, the 2099 universe. This involved titles like Spider-Man 2099, Ravage 2099, Punisher, Doom, etc. This series went from I think 93 to about 98. All the titles were canceled, I think, in 97. And then there was a new series called 2099 World of Tomorrow, and that lasted only 8 issues, and then it was all done for good. And we've had little tiny visits to the 2099 world, sort of. We had a couple of sort of relaunches that basically just reinvented that world completely. It didn't acknowledge any of the history and backstory from those comics, but it's like, well, we really want to have another Spider-Man 2099, so we'll just throw out Time Storm 2099 and we'll put Spidey in there, but then everything else is completely and totally different. I wish I could find the article that I had read that talked about why the 2099 universe ended when it did. I really wish that we could have had more 2099, and just as a side note, this is something that's not even impossible. I wish Marvel would go ahead and collect all of those old 2099 stories into trades. I know that we're getting a second volume of Peter David's Spider-Man 2099, and I believe we are getting an omnibus of sorts of Warren Ellis's Doom 2099. So it's clear that they haven't forgotten this universe, but it seems to me that they are avoiding trying to collect all of it in just a series of volumes. Like, if you've collected the first 9 issues of X-Men 2099, go ahead and collect the rest of that series. Don't just ignore it and jump around in time like, we're going to collect this portion of Doom 2099, but we're not going to collect the rest of it. Collect it all so that I can have it on my shelves, guys. Please, I beg you. I would sell a little bit of my blood if you went ahead and did that. I don't know why you would want my blood, but I would do it. Number 5. I also have a sub-point with this one, so technically it's going to look like I have 11 points, but really this is 5 and 5B. Number 5. Originally, way back in the day when Heroes first started, the big master plan was that each season would have a different set of characters starring, and then at the end of that season, some of them would go away and you wouldn't really see them again, and some of them would come back to the next season. So you'd have sort of a rotating cast of characters. Now, I know a lot of people have said, well, I don't really know if I would have liked that, and I think in execution it probably would have been really problematic. Once you get to know a set of characters over the course of like 23 episodes, and then you no longer see them anymore and you have to get used to a brand new set of characters, that could be a huge problem. And a lot of the new characters, you might not even like them, and you might keep saying, why isn't Peter Petrelli here? I want to see more Peter. Apparently, this whole idea was put the kibosh on by the network. I guess I just made a real sentence, I don't know. The network said, no, you're not going to do this. You're going to keep the characters that you start with. You're going to keep using them. Oddly enough, they do sort of keep going with their idea. Characters that they introduce in Season 2, like Maya and Monica, you don't really see them anymore in Season 3. And characters they introduce in Season 3, they get rid of before Season 4, etc. But the characters from Season 1, those guys stay around. And my problem with this is that some of these characters, quite a few of them in fact, they didn't really have anywhere to go for a multi-season series. You have someone like Claire, her big story arc was coming to terms with who she was and realizing that her father has done some bad things to protect her. Then, in Season 2, her story arc is coming to terms with who she is and realizing that her father has done some bad things to protect her. Then in Season 3, you guessed it, her big story arc is coming to terms with who she is and realizing that her father has done some bad things to protect her. The big reason I think that they did this is because they didn't have anything else to do with her. I am certain that if they had gone with their original plan to phase out characters, they would have gotten rid of Claire because they didn't really have anything left to do with her at the end of Season 1. So, this could have been a problem, but I think it would have made the series at least a little bit more enjoyable in certain aspects. For those of us like myself who really got to hate Claire and really got to hating the recycled plot that they used with her every season, this would have been a godsend, I think. And as I mentioned, I had a sub-point with this one, 5B. I really wish that Heroes had moved on with the virus storyline. If you have seen Season 2, the whole thing is building up to the big bad of that season, Adam Monroe. He is searching for this super virus that is going to wipe out most of humanity. One of the characters, Peter Petrelli, he goes into the future and he finds out that literally less than 1% of humanity survives this disease that Adam Monroe spreads using this virus. What actually happened was Adam Monroe drops the vial, Peter uses his telekinesis to catch it, and then he uses like his fire powers to destroy it, and then Peter, Nathan, and Hero and Matt, they kind of come together and they're like, well, our parents are just really evil people. They've been doing these bad things, and we have to reveal the existence of superpowered people to the world. And then the season ends with Nathan getting shot right when he's about to reveal the existence of superpowered people to the world. Now, if you have a problem with what I just said, then don't worry, I do too, because this feels really weird. Like, how did Nathan get from saying we need to stop Adam Monroe to saying our parents are really evil? Now, don't get me wrong, I do think that Nathan's mother is very evil, but I don't really understand how he got from point A to point B. Originally, the story was supposed to go that Adam would actually drop the virus, and then the state of Texas would kind of get put into this quarantine, so to speak. And then the character of Maya, who was introduced in Season 2, she would have actually become important because her powers involved kind of absorbing a virus into herself. Her and her brother kind of had these powers of releasing a death plague onto people and then absorbing it back into themselves. She would have actually been important. As is, the way the story went, Maya served literally no function in this series, and that's why they got rid of her. The big reason that they decided not to go with this virus storyline is, as per the DVD commentary and the special features on the Season 2 DVDs, apparently they didn't want to leave the fans hanging with a really huge cliffhanger. I know it makes no sense. They ended the season with Nathan Petrelli getting shot. That is, in my opinion, just as huge of a cliffhanger as the virus gets released and then they have to quarantine the state of Texas, but whatever, I don't know. I've come to accept that the people behind Heroes weren't really operating on all cylinders, but I do think this series would have been a lot better if they had just gone with their original plan. So much of Heroes Season 3 sucked so incredibly hard because these guys were having to create an entirely new story that they didn't plan in the first place, and a lot of it just didn't make any sense from square one because it really didn't make any sense from a character perspective at the end of Season 2, and a lot of it was just kind of getting thrown out as they were putting it out there, and it just made Season 3 into a really awful season. So I really think this entire series would have been much better if Season 2 had ended with the virus being released. Then Season 3 could be about these heroes coming together to stop the virus from spreading, and then they can save everyone, and then they can do their little villains escape the prison thing that they wanted to do in Volume 4. I don't know. I think basically the whole series just would have been a lot better. I know I've said that, but I'm saying it again. Number 4. This is the one where I'm kind of breaking the rules, but I really wish I could see The Dark Knight Rises where Heath Ledger never died. I really think that they would have used the Joker again if Heath Ledger was still alive when they made the movie. And unfortunately, Heath Ledger did die, and I'm not saying, boy, I wish that guy didn't die so that we could have had a cool movie. It sounds like I'm saying that, but it really is a tragedy that he did die. But I think that I would have liked to have seen what they would have done with the Joker if they would have used him in the third Batman movie. When you watch The Dark Knight, it really does seem like they are setting up the Joker to be doing something else in The Dark Knight Rises. I don't even know if it would have been called The Dark Knight Rises if they had used Heath Ledger's Joker. Sadly, this is one of those things we will never know what they would have done. I don't think that Christopher Nolan is the kind of guy to release some of his ideas that he never went with. He seems very tight-lipped on that sort of thing. That's the one where I'm kind of breaking my rules the most, but I really wish I could have seen that Batman movie where Heath Ledger's Joker kind of makes a second appearance in that series. Probably somewhat in the background, not as much in the foreground as in The Dark Knight, but I still think it would have been cool. Number 3. In the early 2000s, Grant Morrison did a comic book series called Marvel Boy. Now, this is one of those series that I really liked and is also really confusing. I've read it, I think, once or twice, and it's got a lot of really crazy, heady ideas in it, some of it which just goes way over my head, but I did enjoy it. It's a very fun comic book, and if you have read anything from the last 3 or 4 years, specifically in Brian Michael Bendis' Avengers series, then you know that Brian Michael Bendis took the character of Marvel Boy and kind of used him in his Avengers stories. I haven't read Bendis' Avengers, but from what I have seen, Bendis kind of took the character who acted in a certain way, erased all of his character traits and personality, and gave him an entirely different personality. This happens sometimes. Characters will grow and evolve and change. What I really wish we could have seen was Grant Morrison taking that character and growing him organically from point A to point B, instead of a completely different writer who really just seems to be interested in Marvel Boy because he was a new character that didn't have a whole lot of backstory and continuity, and then erasing everything that made that character interesting. If you have read Marvel Boy, then you know that at the end of that miniseries, I'm going to throw a little spoiler up, so while my thumb is up, I am talking spoilers. You can mute the video real quick. At the end of the Marvel Boy miniseries, Marvel Boy is captured, and he is put into a super prison called the Cube, and it ends with Marvel Boy saying, okay, I'm going to take over this place. Well, then, we never get a sequel to that series. I think the next time we see Marvel Boy, is in a Runaways Young Avengers crossover, either during Secret Invasion or during Civil War. I don't remember which one. And honestly, I have that story, but it was pretty unmemorable because I don't remember anything else about it other than Marvel Boy was there in a cube. We never get to see Marvel Boy taking over the cube. I would kill a small goat to see Grant Morrison do Marvel Boy 2. Sadly, I don't think it's ever going to happen. Right now, Morrison seems pretty upset at Marvel, which part of it was Bill Jemas, who was the president of Marvel in the early 2000s. He basically just didn't really like any of Grant Morrison's ideas. Grant Morrison had pitched a Nick Fury story, which Bill Jemas shot down, and that eventually became his creator-owned story, The Filth. And then Morrison pitched Marvel Boy 2, and Bill Jemas was like, well, this sounds good, but what if you toned it down and made it a little more grounded? And that basically is like saying, well, we really like the idea of a TV show that is shot in color, but what if instead we went with it being shot in black and white? That's about the thing that Bill Jemas was saying to Morrison. Like, take Morrison's strongest quality that he is most well known for and completely take it away. Why even bother having Grant Morrison do the story? You can probably Google around and find what Morrison would have done. Basically, he wanted to have some stories about the Kree religion. He also wanted to create some really, really crazy looking characters to inhabit the cube. I think this would have been amazing. I really would have loved to have seen a second and even third or fourth Marvel Boy story from Grant Morrison. I think he could have made this character one of the characters of the 2000s if he hadn't left the character and gone to DC. All we really know about this series, if it had been a thing, is that Morrison said he would have been influenced by the Marvel comics from the 70s, by guys like Steve Gerber and Steve Englehart, who those guys are very much like the spiritual forefathers of Grant Morrison, and it makes sense that he would have been influenced by those guys in doing a sort of modern-day Spider-Man type character in the sense that he's an angry teenager and he's mad at the world. All I can say is, guys, we should all be weeping that this was never a thing, because it really, really should have been. Number 2. Hellboy 3 should have been made. Now, I went on for years thinking that Guillermo del Toro was basically on purpose not making Hellboy 3. Very recently, like within the last year, Del Toro revealed that it was actually the studio that was not letting him do 3 because Hellboy 2 didn't make enough money. And this makes me very, very sad. I liked the first Hellboy movie okay, and then when I saw the second movie, I liked it a whole lot more, and I can only imagine if Del Toro had done number 3, that it would have been even better, and 2 kind of ends with a huge cliffhanger. A, we're led to believe that Hellboy is going to cause the end of the world, and B, we were led to believe that he was going to have twins with Liz. I think this would have been a killer story to end a trilogy on, and if it had actually happened, I submit to you, it would have been the best superhero trilogy ever. I still don't think we have gotten the best superhero trilogy, and if Hellboy 3 somehow gets made, I think that would definitely be the best superhero trilogy we will ever get if Del Toro went with the ideas that he was hinting at in 2. One thing he said online that he wanted to go with was an archangel who was somehow brainwashed by the Nazis and would be forced to fight Hellboy. I don't know if this would conflict with the idea that Hellboy is going to become the World Eater or whatever it was that they called him, but I do like the idea of archangels being brainwashed by the Nazis. I think that would have been really cool. I've also heard that Rasputin from the first movie would have come back. I didn't really care for Rasputin as a villain, didn't really find him very interesting, but maybe he could have made him work better in the third movie. Basically, this is one that night and day I'm shaking my fist at the sky because someone somewhere said no to a Hellboy movie, and they should not have said no because that absolutely would have been enough to make me cry blood. It would have been wicked awesome, guys. And what is my number 1? I've talked about it a little bit before. Maybe you know what it is, maybe not. I wish I could go back in time and use my magic powers to make Chris Claremont stay on the X-Men books instead of leaving in 1991. Chris Claremont's run on the X-Men is my favorite in the entire franchise. I think even when you take in all the bad stuff that happened during his run, he had some of the best ideas in that entire franchise. And we would not have the X-Men as a mega franchise if it was not for Claremont. We would not have all of the X-Men movies that we have today if it was not for Claremont. I think it's very important that we do not forget just how important he was to the X-Men. So if you're a fan of the X-Men, then maybe you should go and check out Claremont's run. You'll probably find some stuff there that you would really enjoy. Basically, what happened here was that Chris Claremont was working with Jim Lee since roughly 1989. Jim Lee was an artist, but he also wanted to be co-plotting the book. So Chris Claremont's like, okay, yeah, we can co-plot together. Well, then apparently Jim Lee was like, you know, I know I'm co-plotting and I'm drawing, but I want even more of my ideas to be coming in. And Chris Claremont's like, well, that would basically mean that I would have to lead the book in order for you to be doing more. And then Jim Lee starts drawing stuff in the pages that he and Chris Claremont did not plot together. So then Chris Claremont has to be scripting stuff that he did not plan in his stories, and eventually this kind of bitter rivalry of sorts was brought to the attention of editorial, and this was the very early 90s where Todd McFarlane's artwork sold like 1 million copies of Spider-Man issue 1, and Jim Lee's artwork on X-Men issue 1 sold about as much. So the people at Marvel were like, yeah, if we have to choose one or the other, we're going to choose Jim Lee. So Chris Claremont left the X-Men books in 1991. In my humble opinion, the books never bounced back. They were never as good as they were when they were under Chris Claremont's pen. Part of that is that you have someone like Jim Lee, okay, he's replacing Chris Claremont. Then a year later, he goes to found Image Comics, allegedly because he didn't have enough creative control at Marvel, even though he was basically given the reins to the Lamborghini. And then, from that point, even up until today, all of the X-Men books were kind of handled by multiple people. So you might have Scott Lobdell on one book, and then you might have Fabian Nicieza on another book. And the problem with this is, even if Scott Lobdell is doing really great things on his book, and Fabian Nicieza is doing really great things over there, they are not one person. What was really fantastic about Chris Claremont's run on the X-Men was that he was one guy basically controlling the entire franchise. So he knew what he was doing with all of these characters, and even when he was dropping plot lines every once in a while, which, let's be honest, he did do that, he was still the mastermind behind this entire thing. And ever since Claremont left in the 90s, we have not had that. We have not had one really top-notch creator who is able to guide an entire franchise and say, this is what we need to do. We need to have this series be canceled. We need to have this character get their own series, and basically just mapping out everything and having it all be under his control. We have editors who kind of sort of do that, but the editors don't really seem to be keeping things together. They just kind of seem to be letting this guy do his own thing, this guy doing his own thing. You can tell I'm a little bit not really okay with the modern X-Men comics. I have read quite a bit of modern stuff. Some of it is good, some of it's really bad. And yeah, I also know that if Claremont had never left in 1991, eventually he would have left, probably in like 95 or something like that. It would have been a nice round break, 20 years. He came on the book in 75, he would have left in 95. Eventually he would have left, and then things would have gotten bad. But I really think that the X-Men would have been even better than what it is now if he had stayed on the books just a little while longer. And those are my top 10, 11, 12-ish things that I would change if I had the ability to go back in time and change these things. What do you guys think of my list? I hope you approve. What is your own list? Tell me in the comments below, or make a video response. Until then, I will see you guys tomorrow with another kind of video. Catch you later. Have a great day.